Le doy la bienvenida a este su auditorio Jorge Roa Pires. Este auditorio cuenta con un sistema de evaluación que facilitará la salida rápida y ordenada en caso de emergencia. Establecido, ha sido construido como una posibilidad de emergencia que estarán habilitadas y despejadas durante la duración del evento. Creo que en el caso de recibir la orden de evacuación, usted debe mantener la calma y atender las recomendaciones del personal de apoyo. Dar prioridad a niños, mujeres embarazadas y personas con limitaciones en la marcha, tomar sus elementos personales y dirigirse a la salida de emergencia más próxima. Caminar rápidamente sin correr. Dirigirse al punto de encuentro y esperar las instrucciones para su reingreso. Su colaboración con nuestro programa de gestión de riesgo ante emergencias nos garantizará la seguridad y tranquilidad durante su estadía en nuestras instalaciones. Bienvenidos.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is a special day for all of us, especially for our lovely university, Universidad. We have here Dr. Daniel Wilson. He comes from Harvard University. Thank you, Doctor, for accepting our invitation. It is a pleasure for us. Today we have a conference entitled Making a Place for Learning. Dr. Wilson has a really long profile, however, I'm going to read just part of it. Dr. Wilson has a doctorate in education. He's the director of Project Zero at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he's also a principal investigator, a lecturer on education, and educational chair at Harvard Learning Environments for Tomorrow. His interests can be seen in the three areas as his current work. The first one is professional learning in communities. The second one, learning and leadership behavior in the workplace. And the third one, which is the most interesting for us, making learning visible. How can teachers and students create new forms of learning in which their identities and their knowledge can be made more visible for themselves and for others? Since joining Project Zero as a researcher in 1993, Dr. Wilson has also participated on projects such as Teaching for Understanding, Understanding for Organizations, Teaching for Understanding in Universities, Whiteboard Project, Project-Based Learning, and After-School Learning. Thank you so much once again. Thank you for the people who are connected, listening to us today. So the following will be the dynamic. Dr. Wilson will have 30 minutes or so on for his presentation. After that, at the end, we will have 20 or 30 minutes if it's necessary for your questions. Please, questions must be clear and concise. Thank you so much. Dr. Wilson.
Bueno, buenos días. Yo puedo hablar en español, pero yo voy a dar esta charla en inglés. Está bien. Thank you, Consuelo, for this wonderful and thoughtful invitation, and thank you all for joining us in person as well as online. In addition to the academic introduction, let me also say that I'm also a father of 2 teenagers, so you can have I can have your sympathy for being the father of 2 teenagers in today's world. And I also lived in Colombia for 5 years in the 1990s, and we had multiple contracts with the Ministry of Education. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all to discuss a topic that's a perennial one in education and a new one given the wake of the pandemic, because where learning happens has always been a question. But what we're seeing around the world is some interesting forms that draw our attention to exploring more. So I'm going to share some ideas, hopefully provoke some thoughts and conversation that I trust will continue outside of this talk. So the place of learning is not a new question. It's a timeless question. So let's start by going back in time. Imagine the year is 1899. So it's a thought experiment. And you're at the World's Fair in Paris. Well, there was a World's Fair in Paris in 1899. And the organizers of the World's Fair in Paris asked an artist named Jean-Marc Coté to render a number of images of what the world would look like in the year 2000. So he drew images of what hospitals would look like, what the mail service would look like. And he also drew an image of what schools would look like. And I'm going to share that image with you. And the question I want you to ask yourself is, what does learning mean in this image? Now, we might chuckle at this image of how naive it is. Schools don't actually look like that. But we could ask ourselves questions about what is similar in this image of Jean-Marc Coté in today's schools. Lots of disturbing features in this image. But what we've learned over the years is that what learning means was set several hundred years ago in the minds of not just artists like Jean-Marc Coté, but in the minds of policymakers, of teachers, of students, of families. And this image of learning pervades today. That learning is individual, that learning is transmissive, that learning is something that is handed down. You can see this old white man making books, putting them into a machine. Now, clearly learning doesn't look like this, literally. But the belief system of learning still pervades in a number of quarters around the world. Now, over the last 100 years, there's been massive transformations in how we view learning and the place of learning. So certainly, there are new ideas, and I'm not going to go into detail on this talk about them, but it's worth reminding ourselves that this image and ideas around learning were created before the field of psychology was developed. Many of these ideas around what learning is and how it happens were before much of the science around learning and education was developed. So what do we know now? Well, we know now that even the question of who learning is for is vastly different over the last 150 years. In Jean-Marc Cote's image, it's for white males. There's been massive transformations of creating access for all sorts of demographies around the world. There's also been big changes in how learning happens. In Jean-Marc Cote's image, we see the transmission model of learning accentuated through the wires and the machinery. We know that learning is much more than transmission. And what is learning is also quite different. It's not just content from books. Over the last 100 years, there's been a range of new goals and purposes of learning. Ethics, creativity, skills. So although we can laugh at this image, we should critique why it is that the image that we see still pervades a lot of structures, and why it is that who has learning is still a challenge, how we learn is still a challenge, and even what we learn is still a challenge. I want to draw our attention, though, to another question, that is where learning happens. And that's the focus of our time together today. Still to this day, there's an emphasis that learning primarily happens outside of the world in the classroom. Now, there have been many over the decades, there have been many academics and movements to challenge this, but it is a pervasive form. We're going to dwell on what it might mean to re-examine the where of learning, or rather, the place of learning, and what it means to make a place for learning. Now, this argument I'm about to offer doesn't come out of nowhere, as this book would suggest. There's a long history of critiques on the place of learning. One is by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who about 30, 40 years ago offered a harsh critique of objectivity and its pervasiveness in Western thought. And one of the critiques is the more we divorce knowledge from context, the more peril we run as human beings. While objectivity gives us some distance, what Nagel points out is that the dislocation of knowledge, although sometimes helpful, strips it of value. It strips it of experience. It strips it of subjective activity. And there's been other kinds of critiques on where learning could happen. And what Nagel suggests is that, in this image from his book, a library does house a lot of knowledge. It's actually nowhere. That is, the knowledge it's representing comes from different places, different locations. And the more we divorce learning from those locations, the more we lose the humanity. Another voice is a very eminent architect, Yi Fu Tuan, who wrote a book also about 30, 40 years ago called Space and Place. It's a marvelous book, much more accessible, I should say, than Nagel's book. But it's an important voice to remember because as an architect, what Tuan argued was that there's a massive difference between spaces and places. A space is a location. So you can think of your home. It has a location, as an address. A place, though, well, that's different. A place is the space in which we make meaning. We develop attachments to places. And as he says, places emerge from spaces as we create the meaning and values through the experience. This relates to Nagel because Nagel's argument is that the perils of divorcing knowledge from location. As an architect, he's saying Well, there's a difference between a location and a place. And how it is that we interact and develop meanings of places is a priority as we design. Now, just to further complicate this, and because I'm from Harvard and I feel like I need to always complicate things, I'm going to share one more voice. And this is from an economist named Robert Sack, who picked up on both of these ideas, Nagel's and Fwan's, and rendered out a fairly nebulous diagram. But I want to focus you in on at least what the big idea here is that a view from somewhere is a view that is situated in where the meaning resides. So if you look at the bottom of the image here, nature or our environment, meaning, as Juan would say, and social relationships, these are key to humanity. And as we interact in spaces and develop places, what Sack says is that somewhere. We have a location, we know its contextual meanings, and whatever knowledge emerges there, it has that kind of value of somewhere. The further away we get in abstraction, the more we get to Nagel's view from nowhere. No sense of location, no sense of context, no sense of the people and the places. Again, while nowhere has some objective validity, somewhere has the local meaning. What I'd like to do is suggest that the question of the place of learning is not just a geographic question. It's an epistemological question. That is, it's where we locate knowledge, and as we learn, how connected are we to those places? So, what would this look like concretely? Well, here's a provocative idea. How many people remember your school schedule from high school? Do you remember your school schedule from high school? This is the interactive portion of the class. Do you? Yeah, a little bit. Well, I'd like to share with you a high school schedule. You can probably imagine one in your mind. That's what they typically look like. So this is an artifact, as Nagel would say, from nowhere. We're representing knowledge in lots of discrete, perhaps disconnected ways from some of the places where the knowledge emerged. What would a view from somewhere look like? I'm going to share with you a school schedule from a school that I'm working with now in Spain. What you're about to see is on a wall in a K-6 school, and it's their weekly schedule of what students will be doing, similar to this schedule. This is the weekly school schedule of the school in Madrid. And during the pandemic, when they couldn't come to school, the families, the teachers, the administrators got together and they said, well, we can go outside, we can go in our community. So let's find the places in our community where there is knowledge. And those places, perhaps a bakery, where you could teach children chemistry, or an artist's studio where they could teach about color and design. And through working with families and communities, they located all of these resources of knowledge and expertise. And if you're a student in this school, your day looks like going into your community and learning from the expertise in your community, tapping into the resources. It was so successful that after the pandemic, they're continuing with this. Essentially, school is a place where they need to make sense of their experiences and their knowledge, but the knowledge is situated somewhere, not nowhere. Okay, well, let's back up. I should say, this is in Madrid. And often when I share this, some folks say, well, you can do this in Madrid, but what if we live in a rural community? Absolutely. Every place has knowledge and resources. Going back to this image, every place has nature, every place has meaning, every place has social relations. So we can situate knowledge somewhere. Okay, well, what does this look like for us? So if we agree with the argument that situating knowledge somewhere is important, again, I'm not saying objectivity isn't important, but situating it somewhere is important. How do we develop places, this is Tuan's language, where meanings emerge as part of learning? Well, in architecture and design, there's this notion of affordances. Affordances, borrowed from the psychologist Gibson, means that environments can constrain and enable a range of action. And an affordance of an object or space constrains or offers a range of actions. So, for example, you're sitting in a chair. That chair has certain affordances. It allows you to sit. It constrains you too. You can't lean back. Or maybe you can try. But it also has other affordances that are maybe more subtle. So, for example, you could stand on it. You could use it maybe as a trampoline. So the object has affordances, and the design constrains or opens up the range of activities you can use it for. So I'm going to talk about 4 affordances of places, that is, locations in which meaning and value emerges for learning. One of them is agency. And this is a word in English which I think is tricky to translate. But the idea is that places offer affordances of freedom and choice, in which individuals can feel empowered. Now, what does that look like when we're designing a place? Well, there's lots of examples. This is one of my favorite. It's a micro example of a lecture hall at the University of Iowa. Can anyone notice something interesting about this lecture hall? Do you see that the chairs pivot and turn and swivel? So, although it's a lecture hall designed for the kind of transition, we're in a lecture hall now, imagine that your chair actually turned so that you could interact with the person next to you or the person behind you. That's an example of an affordance of agency, where you have more control, more freedom, more choice about your bodily movements and your interactions within the space. And here's another example. I've shared this example with other professors, and they say, my God, that classroom looks like a mess. And it is a mess. This is from Oldham College, an engineering school outside of Boston. And they believe in design thinking and making as part of engineering. This is the freshman intro course to engineering we're looking at. There's massive freedom in this space, in which students choose who to work with, how to represent ideas, what tools to work with. It's hard to even know where the teacher is in this image. This is an extreme form of designing with affordances for agency. The choices, the freedom, the empowerment. Now, let me pause here for a moment. Just because we design a space doesn't mean it's going to be used that way. I'll come back to that. It also means that not everyone will experience it the same way. It's important. As Tuan says, the value emerges in the interactions. We have to embrace the range of meanings that will emerge. Let's continue. Agency is one affordance, and we can ask ourselves, to what degree do I create my place with freedom and choice? What are the constraints and what are the opportunities? A second affordance of places of learning is belonging. That is, how do I feel that I connect with myself, I connect to others, and I connect to my environment? Belonging is one of these key features. If I feel I do not belong, then how is it that I can develop meanings and values and connect within a place? What does this look like? Well, places that emphasize belonging have lots of interesting kinds of affordances. This image on the left is taken from an early childhood center in Bogota. The organization is called AEIO2. They operate throughout Colombia. They work with migrant populations from Venezuela and some of the poorest barrios in Colombia. They invite parents to bring in old shoes, and they line their entranceway, the paths, with old shoes, things that would be thrown away. And they engage the parents in planting things in those shoes and writing notes about what this place means to them. So if you were to walk into the school, you'd be experiencing the voices of the parents and other people who are connected to that place. And that emphasizes belonging. Connected self-connection, connecting to others, connecting to the environment. This is another image from a school just outside us in Spain, where one of the features in a hallway is a mirror. And I'm not sure if you can read some of the details of these images, but around the mirror. But these are invitations to say things to yourself in the mirror. Some of these things say, I am loved. I am valued. So it's a very small object that offers the affordance of connection. Connection to self, connection to others. Well, belonging can look a little bit larger in form too. Many of us may have seen open classroom styles of learning in schools. There are some challenges here, mainly acoustic challenges. But there is a finding drawn from urban architecture and design around people are socially connected when they live in compact neighborhoods. What does compact mean? In which you can get your needs met in a very little distance around where you live. There's this idea of the 15-minute city. I don't know if people know of this idea, but it's a movement in which cities and urban centers are being designed so that any person can get their needs met, whether it's food, or laundry, or safety, within 15 minutes of where they live. Compactness can be seen in lots of architectural designs in some schools. This image at the left is a very compact version of this, where students can get different kinds of needs met in one location. They don't have to go to another place within the school. Belonging can also be the different kinds of features we design. So if we look to the right, this is actually in the same location. It's a reading area. And it's an interesting way to develop a reading area that is both closed and open. Closed gives a little privacy, some connection with others. Open, so that people can see each other. Visual connection with others in the environment is an affordance for developing belonging. Agency, belonging, two other affordances just to put on your list. And there's curiosity. How do we design spaces and materials and objects to spark curiosity? Well, first we have to design for noticing things. I mean, if we don't notice things, it's hard to be curious. Well, here's where our senses are important. A number of people who develop playgrounds, for example, try to use different kinds of sensorial data, whether it's touch and smell, sight and sound, to introduce the unfamiliar into our experience. A lot of urban designers have known this for years. So, for example, what we found is, or what they found, is that introducing novel objects into the environment can surprise people. It can enable individuals to pause. Curiosity is about pausing first, and then it's about exploring. So tapping into our senses to feel surprise is an important aspect. And the very objects we introduce have affordances for curiosity. This is one of my favorite studies done in a museum setting, in which they introduced a number of interventions and looked at how those interventions impacted the learning interactions between children and their caregivers. So, for example, you've been to a museum, you likely know that some museums have signs, the things you can read, so they introduced signs. Another intervention was they gave the adults cards of questions to ask the child. There was a range of interventions, but the most effective intervention that supported the exploration is so simple. They turned the lights down and they gave children flashlights. And that enabled focus and attention and curiosity and exploration. The simple flashlight allowed spotlighting between the child and the adult. And that's an affordance for curiosity. I should also say the flashlight is connected to other affordances too. There's agency there that's connecting to, but curiosity is the main goal here. Okay, one more. And finally, delight. How do we develop spaces and objects and materials so that we experience joy and satisfaction, a sense of pride, positive affect? Oh, there's lots of ways we could do this. Some of them are going to be very culturally dependent, and they should be. Remember, we're searching for a view from somewhere. So how is it that we could create materials and moments in which we feel these things? Well, a number of urban researchers have looked at how the introduction of exhibits, novel exhibits in public spaces invoke delight. This is an installation in Chicago where they introduced mirrors on the sidewalk. And they just studied the social forms. And what they found was people paused, they were surprised, and they started to have fun with these objects. There's lots of other ways we could think about creating the affordances in our environment for delight. Some of it might be thinking about the materials, how the materials allow us to feel safe or comfortable. That's a form of feeling delight, the safety and the comfort. But there are many others that we could discuss. But for this morning, I wanted to at least put 4 on our minds. 4, as you can see from the slides, the ABCDs of learning places. Now, let me end with some caveats here. While many of these ideas aren't new, it's very, very difficult to realize because we're talking about an interdisciplinary task. We're talking about making the place to learn. So some of us might be educators, some might be architects, some might be engineers, some of us might be policymakers. It will require an interdisciplinary conversation and dialogue to understand what these 4 affordances look and feel like in a cultural context. But I want to underscore one important lesson I've learned over the 20+ years of doing this work. A building is not the change. Just because we build something doesn't mean it's going to be used for this purpose. And in many cases, the world is littered with interesting architectural forms that have fallen short on their aspirations for learning. I can't tell you how many schools I've walked into that have tried to redesign their spaces, but they've forgotten about places, the meaning making, the interrelationships, the environments. So while a building is one piece of it, it's not the change. The change is more about how do we believe learning should happen. And that's a mindset. If we believe learning is transmissive, then we will design buildings that are very similar to the Jean-Marc Coquet image I shared earlier. If we believe learning involves agency, and belonging, and curiosity, and delight, beautiful and very different kinds of forms will emerge. But a building is not the change. The change is in the interaction between these three areas, and I'll end here. We're talking about place. That is the location in which we as human beings develop meanings and values through our interactions. And those places we can critique, we can develop, we can attempt to change in small or macro ways. But that in and of itself isn't sufficient. We have to think about the practices. Just because we design a place with certain affordances does not mean that it will lead towards a new pattern of practice. Maybe. But oftentimes when we design places, say a place for project-based learning, we're assuming that the individuals know how to do these things. Oftentimes, there needs to be work on just what the practice is of the local time. And even place and practice aren't enough. We have to think about the purpose. If you remember that image from Jean-Marc Coquet, I said the big transformations over the last century and a half have been who has access to learning, how learning happens, what is learned, and we're talking about where. But there's another transformation, the purpose, why learning is important for a community, for a nation, for societies. Historically, the answer to that has been for religious or power. And that is, we want to confine who has access to learning. Over the last few hundred years, thankfully, those norms have changed in some regions of the world. But today, most of the rationale for learning is very economic. It's to get a job. And while vocation is important, let's not forget that as citizens, as human beings, we also want to be ethical. We also want to be moral. And so let us not forget that purpose is another important element of these three. When they all align, that is, we have a belief of learning, we have a place that supports that belief, and we have practices. Those three then suggest that we have an effective learning place. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope some of these ideas felt new, maybe some familiar, and I look forward to a conversation. Thanks. How would we like to proceed? ¿Cómo podemos continuar? ¿Quieres? Yo no sé si hay algunas preguntas o conexiones que queramos hacer y hay un micrófono. Si hay un micrófono. Yo estoy aquí por una conversación.
Buenos días. Bueno, muchas gracias por la charla. Creo que es muy pertinente para lo que estamos. Yo soy la directora de Relaciones Internacionales de la universidad y creo que el punto que tocó acerca de la interdisciplinaridad para asumir, digamos, la educación es algo que estamos tratando de involucrar no solamente en ese perfil de egreso, sino en el aula. Cómo conectamos nuestro entorno precisamente independientemente de lo que estudiamos, si somos licenciados en básica primaria, si somos ingenieros de sistemas, si somos administradores ambientales, cómo estamos todos interconectados para resolver problemas de nuestro entorno local, nacional e internacional. Precisamente esa es como la visión que estamos llevando a partir de lo que denominamos acá en la universidad la renovación curricular. Entonces, hablar de una renovación curricular, debemos pensar también en cómo nos vamos a unir con estas otras áreas del conocimiento para poder crear esos procesos que usted mencionaba ahí, de agencia, precisamente cómo los estudiantes se convierten en esos agentes de cambio, pero no solo en su área del conocimiento, sino interactuando con otros, ese sentimiento de pertenencia, de belonging. ¿Cómo lo hacen? Pues interactuando con su comunidad inmediata. Luego de su comunidad inmediata, ¿cómo llevan eso a replicarlo al mundo? Y finalmente, pues esa curiosidad, yo creo que es lo que tenemos que despertar en nuestros estudiantes a todo nivel, desde pregrado, maestría, pues en el caso por el que usted nos visita, que es el doctorado en ciencias de la educación, para poder generar ese delight, que más allá del delight es como, bueno, cómo realmente me apropio de lo que estoy aprendiendo, cómo realmente sí hago parte de ese proceso de aprendizaje. Entonces, creo que es un abrebocas muy interesante a lo que nosotros dentro de la Universidad Tecnológica de Pereira estamos intentando crear en los diferentes programas, independientemente del grado. De hecho, también es importante esa eh, no interdisciplinaridad, pero movernos entre estudiantes de pregrado, estudiantes de posgrado, como también esas diferentes visiones y niveles académicos permiten eh, crear soluciones. Entonces, pues me pareció muy pertinente. Estuve también leyendo cuando el doctora Consuelo me comentó pues, que usted venía a visitarnos en el marco del proyecto Cero, y sé que tienen una parte precisamente de estudios interdisciplinares y de pensamiento global. Entonces, ese pensamiento global va más allá de la globalización, sino cómo tenemos esta visión un poco más sistémica y holística de cómo nos estamos conectando para relacionarnos con nuestro medio. Entonces, esa era mi aporte, más que una pregunta, era sentirnos identificados pues, un poco con los procesos de enseñanza-aprendizaje que pues, están en la universidad y que obviamente la Facultad de Educación, está la decana con quien hemos venido también trabajando mucho en esa reconfiguración un poco, y pues creo que estas son las distinciones que se deben precisamente llevar y propiciar en los diferentes espacios. Así que muy inspirador como modelo. Pienso que esos 4 elementos vale la pena señalarlos y bueno, muy contentos y agradecidos de que esté acá en la universidad. Doctora.
Thank you. And, yes. No, yo entendí más o menos. I mean, it's a massive challenge to articulate, and often it's hard to know where to start. And I certainly don't have the answers, but I have some thoughts. I mean, one is when we're designing systems, we need to remember that systems are a solution to some problem. And so what's the problem we're trying to solve? Oftentimes systems, once they're designed, they take on a life of their own. So the system becomes the goal. As we're looking to create this new form of interdisciplinary connection to help solve real problems in the environment, I would ask myself, where in our school does this practice already exist very well? And learn deeply from the few professors or maybe some of the students who already know how to do this. Because if it already exists, I mean, if we have some interdisciplinary collaboration, that's good. That means that the practice exists in our social system, even though it's not widespread, it does exist. Now our job as leaders and designers is to amplify it, to remove the barriers, to enhance the conditions. That's in contrast to if we assume the practice doesn't exist, that's a different intervention. That's about skilling up people with lots of training. Oftentimes it's coercive, frankly. So those are two very, very different approaches. So if the practice exists, which I assume it does, that's a good sign. It's like the organism lives already in this ecosystem, the practice. So we just have to learn how to let it thrive. If an organism doesn't live in the ecosystem, if we put it into it, it will get rejected by that ecosystem. So they're just two. Let me end with just a resource, and I'm happy to continue the conversation afterwards. I mentioned at Consuelo that I'm part of a project with the United Nations with a group called the Principles for Responsible Management Education, PRIME. It's a group created from the General Assembly, and it involves 850 universities around the world. They're all signatories to attain the Sustainable Development Goals in the United Nations. We've been working with them to articulate a pedagogical framework that other universities can use that are very connected to the aspirations roadmap. That is how to engage students so they feel empowered, they can work interdisciplinarily, they can work in the world, like in their local environments, etc. It's a free set of resources. So if you go, I was just looking at that. I'm happy to share them, but if you Google UNPRME, there's some pedagogical resources that might be useful. Happy to. That's what I am. There are no answers. Oh. Yes. Yeah, and it's going to depend even within the say the disciplinary group, and it's going to depend on the person, and it's going to depend on the students, which will change everything. So in a way, from a systems point of view, we're embracing the emergence within the system. And that's important, and that's hard, but that's organic. And that's the way, if anything, what we've learned over the last few decades, generally speaking, in healthcare and government and education too, inorganic systems have severe weaknesses because they don't adapt as well. So the more organic the system, the better. That's my perspective. Happy to take another question or connection. I don't know if it's pregunta or conexión or inquietud.
I do. Thank you. Well, and most of the people that are here with us have any kind of relationship with undergrads, especially those that are in our educational faculty, which are going to be teachers in the future. So it is a special challenge for us because they need another kind of relationship or knowledge of the world. So can you give us some strategies, specific strategies that we can develop with them during our class? Thank you.
Yeah. The most specific strategy is also very general. And that is, I teach people who will become teachers. And the most important thing that I do, and a number of other professors do, is they engage teachers in learning. What does that mean? Ask the students, what's one thing you want to learn? I mean, maybe it's I want to learn how to play guitar. Maybe it's I want to learn how to bake, something. Or I want to learn how to improve my relationship with my father. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But then have that person and another person deeply examine their learning process. So experiencing learning is something that every teacher needs to know what it feels like. There is no theory of learning, a contemporary theory of learning, in which somewhere the notion of conflict doesn't appear. Conflict, I don't mean violence, I mean disruption, is critical to learning. And many of us as human beings and as teachers, we struggle with what it means to feel confused, what it means to feel vulnerable, what it means to make mistakes. Creating spaces where future teachers can deeply engage in learning and feel the emotional terrain of that is critical. Otherwise, they won't be able to develop the conditions or the context or the places for others to learn. Though we will continue to repeat very traditional form. So that's something, it's going to depend a lot on who you are as your teacher, but opening up those very personal spaces for learning anything, and then studying, focusing, reflecting on what it feels like to learn, that would be my suggestion.
Thank you so much. No more questions? Okay, I think that's it.
Bueno,
Thank you so
muchísimas
much.
gracias para
Thank
su
you.
atención esta mañana, y yo creo que por lo menos yo soy muy curioso. Si ustedes tienen algunas preguntas o cosas, yo estoy muy fácil para conectar a través de email, con mucho gusto me puedo ayudar. Gracias.